Hey, welcome everybody. We are so happy to have you here from different parts and corners of where we are at. Welcome to our webinar called Bridging the Gap, Certification, Compliance, and Climate Readiness for Africa Businesses. This webinar is brought to you by ALN Academy as well as B-Lab Africa, and we're really excited to have you here today. Next slide. So as we begin, I just want to quickly introduce you to the two organizations that are collaborating on this webinar, and in terms of just sort of helping you understand the people who are there for you. This webinar is brought to you by ALN Academy, which is a rule of law charity established as a branch of the Africa Legal Network. So we are just really focused on capacity building and ensuring that the rule of law advances economic growth in Africa. Next slide. Our partner in this webinar is B-Lab Africa, which is a regional partner of the global B-Lab network that's headquartered, and it's headquartered here in Nairobi. It advances the B Corp movement across Africa, whose mission is to catalyze a shift towards stakeholder-driven business practices. B-Lab Africa provides the framework for companies to become certified B corporations or B Corps that meet rigorous standards of social and environmental performance, accountability, and transparency. And joining us from B-Lab is going to be Fabian, who's going to have some very fantastic insights. Today, I'll be your moderator. My name is Rutendo Nyako. I'm the Rule of Law Advisor here at ALN Academy, and I'd like to introduce you to all of our wonderful speakers for the day. Well, here's our lineup. So we are joined by Fikayo Aga, who's an associate in governance, risk, and compliance at ALN Nigeria. We are also joined by Wango Kanyaru, who's a partner at ALN Kenya, and will be speaking a lot on climate readiness and climate investing, and a lot of other far more interesting things that you'll be hearing about today. We are also going to be joined by Fabian Sukulu, who is a business development manager at B-Lab Africa. And stay tuned as we go on for the webinar, so you'll hear about B-Lab Africa Summit in Johannesburg in October. So that's promising to be super exciting. John Madenge, who's the technical director at ICT Mentor Solutions, and Caroline Gishura, who's a risk and compliance practitioner at African Originals. If you've ever heard of KO, all right, so once again, so grateful to all of our speakers, so grateful to all of you for joining us. And what we're really just going to go through is just setting the scene in terms of what's happening with certification, compliance, regulation are concerned, all the big words that today we hope will unpack for you and sort of help your businesses understand, where to take it forward or how to move forward. So we're here because certification and compliance are not side issues. They've become central to how African businesses access markets, attract investment, and remain competitive in a rapidly changing global economy. So our focus today is not what certification or regulation is, although elements of that are going to come out, but it's rather on focusing on how to make these processes realistic, affordable, and aligned with Africa's economic priorities, as well as the business priorities of those businesses operating in Africa. Next slide. So in Africa, micro, small, and medium enterprises form the backbone of our economies. They make up about 90% of all businesses, contribute between 40 and 50% of GDP, and provide about 80% of jobs. In Kenya alone, these businesses generate 40% of the GDP and over half of all new jobs. In Nigeria, they account for 70% of industrial and 95% of manufacturing jobs. So you can see what a big impact they have there. But despite this, ESG adoption is very limited. Only 15% of East African firms report high awareness of ESG, and just over 22% of executives have invested in related initiatives. So you can see that the uptake here is quite low. Next slide. Where climate finance gaps and external pressures are concerned, climate finance is a bigger part of the puzzle. Africa still needs $2 trillion between 2020 and 2030 to meet its obligations under the Paris Agreement, and yet only receives 23% of that investment each year. That funding is also unevenly distributed here in Africa, with East Africa receiving 35% of available funds, and Southern Africa, not so much. Now, this may look like a challenge, but there are opportunities to unpack. Proactive regulatory alignment, for instance, that we're seeing in Rwanda, is giving us an example of what we could do towards ensuring better climate readiness, better climate-aligned investment, and a greater adoption of these. Next slide. When done right, certification becomes more than about compliance, but rather it can rebrand organizations and strengthen their position in the market. But at the same time, there is this relationship that certification has with regulation in complying with local laws and the multiple jurisdictions a company may find themselves in. And this is why we're here today, to try and bridge that gap, to try and see where these two things intersect for the benefit of African businesses and where they diverge. So we're really looking forward to that conversation and hopefully walk away with a lot of way forward. So I'd like to encourage all of you to please scan the QR code, ask your questions. You can also use the Q&A function. We'll be right here to take all of your questions as we go. So without much ado, I would like to open a round of thoughts and insights and trends from our speakers. So from your vantage point and experience, what are the trends you are seeing in Africa when it comes to certification, compliance, and climate readiness in Africa? And how do these impact businesses of different size? So I'm opening the floor, starting with Fabian, and then we can just sort of go around the room.
No, thank you, Rutendo. Thank you also to the Africa Legal Network for setting together this discussion. Can I begin by introduction and then jump straight into the conversation? Is that okay? Great, yeah. So my name is Fabian Sukulu. I work at BILAB Africa. We are the global partner for BILAB Global on the African continent. Maybe just to give you a bit of context before I get into it. So we have our mother company who's BILAB Global, and for BILAB Global to then advance and ensure that we meet our mandates, certifying and setting aside businesses that are doing fantastic work with not just focusing on profits, but being purpose-led and operating as a force for good in the community to benefit people and the planet. Then it was necessary that we then set up regional business units. And hence the same way we have BILAB Australia, we have BILAB France, BILAB US and Canada. Similarly, then we have BILAB Africa, which has a mandate for B Corp certification programs and consultancy for B Corp certification on the African continent. So to get started on the on Rutendo's question, the trends and how they setting businesses up. So the trends are very clear. First of all, and to be honest, a lot of the times business decisions are usually driven by consumers. The current crop of consumers are consumers who are very aware, who are very intentional about how they spend their money, right? About how they exchange value. So awareness then would reflect things like, as I'm buying a drink, I want to make sure that whatever ingredients that go into that drink, if they have to come from a farmer, and I'm buying a drink that is premiumly priced, does me paying that premium for that drink also imply or mean that that farmer who was able to source that ingredient into that drink, did they also get a premium for their product, right? And because I'm getting that product from a farmer who's being paid a premium, if the answer is yes, then did that farmer also farm that ingredient? It could be anything like mint, it could be a watermelon spice, it could be a garnishing of an orange or a tangerine. But the question is that they're getting a premium for their produce. Have they also gone over and above to ensure that they're also giving a premium ingredient? It's to say that they do not use fertilizer that is not organic. They also do not use pesticides that are harmful to the environment. that they do not also pollute rivers around them, because this also means that the farmer further down the stream has their sheep, their cows, and so on and so forth, or they need to use that water for their own personal home use. Then are they also making sure that whatever they are doing, they're also safeguarding the community and the environment around them. So that sits very well with the conscious new age consumer. And therefore, like I said before, the conscious buying decision of the consumer then goes on to then determine the trends that businesses pick up on. Now, to answer the question directly, the trends driven by the consumers are affecting how businesses are then deciding to become compliant to what they are required to do, and businesses are going over and above to showcase that they've done that. And this can take different shapes. It could be, for example, a company deciding to certify as a B Corp, because then consumers are aware that a B Corp certified company means that they are responsible in everything that they do. It could also mean that John Madenge helps companies to do ISO. They've also gone ahead and covered everything and every step to ensure that their processes are also aligned. It could also be government requirements and new EU laws that are going to come into effect. And that is all continuously going to grow and become better. So I hope, without saying too much, I've been able to sort of like give an indicator as to how that is going by, and I'm happy to come back and provide more information and feedback.
Thanks, Fabian. I really like that line that you just used, the conscious new age consumer. So I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about that as we go. Caroline, I don't know if you've got some insights, some trends. What are you seeing there by African origins?
Thank you. Thank you, Rotendo. So yes, let me start with an introduction. My name is Caroline. I'm the Risk and Compliance and Sustainability Manager at African Originals. So we manufacture alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages in Kenya. So we're based in Nairobi, but we also export to countries within Africa and also within the Europe and the Americas. So as a compliance and sustainability practitioner, so I've noted an increased regulatory pressure and the need for standardization, so both within Kenya and the rest of Africa. So you'll note that there are a lot of ESG related regulations being introduced. So for instance, even in Kenya, we have the CBK asking banks to have climate risk disclosures, and how this now comes to businesses. So for instance, your bank, your local bank will ask to see your NEMA permits, which is something that, if you think of previously, that was something that was unheard of, but now we have our banks asking to see for our NEMA permits to show that we are compliant. And also you'll see in things like NEMA introducing the EPR, so wanting businesses to take accountability of the waste that they introduce into the market, and also something like the nutrient profile that has been introduced by the Ministry of Health. Because as Fabian said, right now, the consumers that we have are very aware. And I think at this point that the businesses that they are patronizing are a force for good. And also across the region, so for instance, you'll see bodies like EAC pushing for harmonization, even with things like labeling, so that across the board, whether you export your products or if you export your products into, for instance, EAC, there's that requirement where they're pushing for harmonization. And at this point where how I see certifications coming into play sometimes, and I think maybe this is, so in Kenya we see it, I don't know about the rest of Africa, you'll have regulators who introduce regulations without thinking them through, without providing a framework. And for us, we also see certifications as a framework for compliance. So for instance, NEMA will tell you to do something, but not provide a framework. But then if you refer to, for instance, B Corp, you get an idea, okay, this is how, this is what the global standards are, which is a good point of reference. and how this impacts businesses. So I think you've observed that large companies have resources to integrate these compliance systems and manage the emerging regulations. But also for SMEs, there is that added pressure because of the cost and complexity that comes with new regulations and also even certifications. I think something else that I've also observed is the rise of ESG expectations. So this is from consumers, investors, and even like partners in business. So these are, for instance, like our suppliers. So for instance, like with our investors, you find that they want us to do more reporting to demonstrate that we are actually a force for good, that we are doing we are meeting our needs, but also making sure that we don't interfere with the ability of future businesses to meet their needs. And the impact in the industry, you'll find that multinationals currently are setting very high climate target standards, and also even like the reporting standards that they have for themselves. Like it's quite high and quite ambitious. But also when you look at the impact on local businesses and ESGs, there's that trying to figure out like, okay, so what is this ESG? How how to balance investing into the business, because most SMEs, as we know, are not yet there financially. So there's also that balancing act between investing in the business or pursuing a certification, because as we know, certifications, the investment pays out a bit slower and a bit later, but sustainably. Yeah, I think that's my contribution for now.
Thanks a lot, Carolyn. I think that was quite helpful. I think for those of you who don't know, the NEMA is the National Environment Management Authority of Kenya. So look that up, everyone. But I think what was really critical in terms of what you're saying is sort of the pressures that local businesses are feeling, where global issues are now translating into local ones, and the balance that businesses now have to sort of play between trying to comply, but also, run a business and still meet the costs that come with this. So very, very interesting there. And I think what you also said about the framework aspect, which is, sometimes certification can play some filler where, a regulation has been introduced and there is an insufficient framework to assist businesses with complying accurately. So thank you so much for that. Wangoi, you are up next.
Thanks, Rutendo, and thanks, Fabian and Caroline, for your very interesting insights. I think I'd probably say three things that pick up on some of the points that have been made. One is that looking at this from a lawyer's perspective, I'm a corporate advisory and transactional lawyer who has spent a large part of my career advising investors on potential investments into companies, advising companies on compliance in the context of changing regulations, and then also increasingly helping companies begin to understand the intersecting and the overlapping risks and obligations that come from sustainability-related disclosures, as well as climate-related risks. So there's been, in my practice, an evolution where you'd be asked by an investor to do due diligence on a company, and as Caroline says, you're given a list of permits, you're given a list of requirements that they've met, you tick those boxes, put them on the shelf, prepare some warranties or other protections in your transaction documents, and move on into a scenario where companies, once the investor comes in, are then required to have post-completion action plans. So now that you've gotten the money to grow your business or to scale up or to diversify your market, you now need to have compliance and reporting obligations demonstrating that you have met these particular standards or requirements in your environmental, your social, and your governance obligations. And very often those requirements are higher than what the market standard is in terms of what the law provides in each of these countries. And they're intended to demonstrate a higher basis of compliance on the theory that running your business sustainably over time is not just good for people and for planet, but it actually generates more profit because your business becomes more sustainable, and because it's more resilient. You're thinking more strategically about risk, and you're thinking more strategically about how to manage that risk. Now, the key point in terms of the intersection with climate risks is how a number of these certifications and standards have gone from being voluntary or from being requirements of financiers and investors into becoming mandatory. So in particular, starting with the EU and the sustainability due diligence directives and the sustainable disclosure reporting directives that came out in the last 2 to 3 years, things went from being tasks or undertakings companies took on to demonstrate good stewardship and good corporate citizenship into mandatory requirements that have fines attached to them, that have potential liability for non-compliance attached to them, and also extend beyond the company's own jurisdiction into their supply chain. So the downstream aspect of what Fabian was talking about, a company like, say, for example, Unilever, that has a supply chain that goes all the way into various emerging markets for various raw materials, would have to demonstrate that it has taken steps from a due diligence perspective to make sure that its local suppliers throughout its subsidiaries are in fact operating in a manner that's consistent with managing climate risks, as well as demonstrating good business and human rights practices. All of this to say, in a nutshell, it's gotten very complicated. Businesses can no longer sort of tick boxes, have permits that they take out and show to someone and carry on with their business. They have to think in a much more long-term way about their risk. And also, because these provisions are now becoming mandatory, there's a potential for liability. So it's not a good enough, it's not a nice to have, it's something that has to be consistently built into your business planning. I think the last thing I would say on that in terms of trends is, because certification started off as voluntary and then now has the regulatory context has become more mandatory and created liability risks, what the opportunity that's happening, and it's happening probably too slowly for businesses' comfort, is that there's actually a harmonization at a global level of certain standards that are now being sort of concretized into accounting standards. So John's going to talk about ISO certification processes, for example. There's the International Sustainability Standards Board that develops accounting standards and has recently, in the course of the last year, developed, IFRS S1 and S2 that are sustainability disclosures as well as climate disclosures. And countries are adopting those at a varying scale. Kenya, for example, intends by 2029 to have small and medium enterprises reporting sustainability-related and climate-related disclosures across all sectors. And so there's a convergence now. On one hand, businesses would have to be trying to figure out which standard do I pick and which investor will value that standard, or how will consumers react to it. There's going to be a standardization. But also, on the other hand, it then means the cost of doing business is going to increase, because these disclosures have to be accountants and other people have to be upskilled into being able to make these disclosures. Companies have to be upskilled into compliance with those disclosures. And so, in short, it was very broad, very disjointed, very fragmented. There's an attempt to systematize, to streamline, to bring things into alignment. But what that means for a business is you have to now think 3-4 years ahead and start preparing for those costs of compliance. And start reorienting yourself to seeing this not just as a thing to do, but an attitude to have towards your business.
Thanks a lot, Wangoi. Some scary things there that you're just saying. Something that has started off as voluntary has become mandatory. It's a little bit disjointed, but people are trying to bring it into alignment. And so one has to actually start thinking about their business plan and how to integrate the cost of these standards that are increasingly becoming mandatory. So hopefully we'll see a day where it all just merges nicely together, and certification and regulation just kind of become one and the same. And it won't be so costly on businesses, as we've already heard. from Caroline. I would like to welcome Fikayo to the conversation. Fikayo is from ALN Nigeria, so perhaps you could give us some trends, the things that you're seeing from that side of the world. We'd be very curious about that.
Thank you very much, Rotendo, for that, and thank you to the amazing speakers. There's so much insights to glean from. My name is Fikayo Aga, and I'm representing Adiolu Amido. She heads the Governance, Risk and Practice Unit at ALN Nigeria, Alukano Ibode. I'm an associate in the law firm of Alukano Ibode, Nigeria. So warm greetings to you from Nigeria. Before I dive into to respond to Rutendo's question, I just want to ask one question to the audience, to the panelists. You don't need to respond to the question. Is sustainability a buzzword? It's just something I want you to ruminate on, to think about. Is sustainability a buzzword? So now to answer Rutendo's question, in Nigeria and across Africa, businesses of all sizes are facing increasing pressure to comply with certification standards, environmental regulations, and climate readiness initiatives. And I can say that this trend is driven by internal factors like growing awareness of sustainability. Recall that I asked if sustainability is a buzzword, and there are also external factors that drive awareness. In Nigeria, as a legal practitioner, of course, I'm going to speak from the Nigerian perspective. I'll say that there is a subtle pressure from investors in my experience when advising startups, when raising Series A, B, C funds on behalf of these startups. We see, like Mangoy has said, some of these investors ask for permits, licenses. They want to see that these companies have the right practices and procedures that are sustainability friendly. So there is that subtle pressure from investors. And aside from that, from the regulatory perspective, I would say that Nigerian regulators are sort of pressured, for lack of a better word, to align with global practices, particularly in the financial sector. So we've seen regulators such as the Central Bank of Nigeria. We've seen the Nigerian Stock Exchange, now called the Nigerian Exchange. We've seen the Securities and Exchange Commission. They've released sustainability disclosure guidelines. Some of them have released reporting tools and reporting guidelines for companies that operate within their regulatory purview. And I would say that all these measures are just put in place to ensure that these organizations are in line with global best practices. And interestingly, when Rotendo put up the slide, I saw that she flagged that Nigeria has adopted the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. Yes, we were the first country to adopt it, and I'm just going to speak lightly on that. 2 years ago, yes, that was June 2023, Nigeria became the first country to adopt the IFRS standards. And further to that, the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, that's the FRCN for short, they released a roadmap report for the adoption of the standards. And I'll say that we are in our early adoption phase. We've seen some public companies such as MTN PLC, MTN Nigeria PLC, Fidelity Bank PLC, Access Bank PLC, they've adopted the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. So just to bring things to a close, I would say that there is subtle pressure from investors. There's also alignment. A lot of regulators are seeking to align with global best practices. That's why that's the trends that we're seeing in Nigeria. So I'll just pass the baton back to Rutendo to take it up from there.
Thanks, Fikayo, for starting us off with is sustainability, a buzzword, and then sort of taking us forward in understanding sort of, that there are quite a number of benefits of alignment. But interestingly, something you kind of said but didn't really say is how the public companies are leading the way in terms of these adoptions. So I'm sure there's quite a number of pressures that come when public companies are doing that for local businesses themselves, who now are like seeing this big trend happening and having to also follow suit. Last but not least, John, do you want to give us some insights related to the digital transformation aspect?
Thank you, Luthendo. Thank you everyone for your comments, insights, and learning a lot and writing a lot of notes here, which aligns with what we are seeing. So my name is John Matenge from ICT Mentors. I lead technical, where we implement a lot of ISOs, a lot of data protection, global best practices. Yeah, and just to pick on what Fikayo has said, there's quite a lot of regulatory requirements we are seeing in the marketplace. Virtually every other country has a Data Protection Act requirements. We have the Protection Act of 2019 in Kenya. We have Data Protection of Tanzania. We have Data Protection of South Africa. We have the same in Nigeria. So we're seeing a lot of regulatory requirements. And as Wangui said, these all started as voluntary, but now they're becoming mandatory, and there's penalties attached to that. So we're seeing a lot of that as a trend. The other trend we are seeing is, because you need to have more than one of those integrated approach towards, certification or compliance, where you take 2 or 3 and for cost and cost management, you implement them together. So there's quite a lot of that, bringing all those compliance together in an attempt to implement and comply at the same time. We're also seeing a lot of cross-border business. And just to add to what Fikayo has said, the investors are demanding, are you complying with data privacy? Are you complying with this law? Have you complied with, are you compliant with ISO standard, for instance? Have you complied with GDPR? So there's quite a lot of that. So most of the requests that are coming to us are based on customers' need. The other trend we are seeing is a need to show your investors and your customers that you're complying, so to build trust as well. So there's quite a lot we're seeing as far as that is concerned. Data and data protection has become a big thing. The only way to enforce this is to implement these compliances. So they are not only a way of ticking box, but more of a strategic way of also managing your risk and making sure that you mitigate them, because they have a big impact on your business. In most cases, data is the biggest asset an organization holds, and in some cases, you're also not able to attach value to it. So there's quite a lot of that we are seeing in the marketplace. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. I think you've raised quite a number of important points and sort of touch on what everybody's saying. I would say, and please, my fellow speakers, feel free to disagree with me here, but from what I'm picking up from your various insights here, there's quite a lot of external pressures for businesses to, sort of uphold the regulations and to certify. On one instance, Fabian's already mentioned that it's consumer driven, but it also seems to be investor driven. So I'm asking myself, to what extent is it like an internal, Rutendo in my business, I just, deeply interested in being a sustainable organization, or it's these pressures that are creating these questions, and which leads us back to Fikayo's reflection, which is sustainability somewhat a buzzword. Another thing as well we're noticing is the issue of cost that has been mentioned quite a lot, complying and trying to implement various certifications and also complying with the regulations is also increasingly becoming difficult and a costly affair. So increasing pressures on local economies that are facing their own domestic economic pressures. So having noted all of these insights, it's looking a bit scary now. It's not, I suppose it's not just a buzzword, it's a real reality to where certification and compliance are concerned from all of you, that needs to shake us up and wake us up a little bit. So I suppose from here, we really want to understand the purpose and value of certification. Wango, I don't know if you can, sort of open it up for us, letting us know, where companies are on their certification journey, small, medium, large, and, how exactly does this tie into investing? We keep hearing this issue of investors, but, help us make make it make sense.
Thanks, Rutendo. That's a tall task, but I'll do my best to respond to that question. The question of where are companies when it comes to certification is an interesting one, and it really depends on the stage of their life cycle that they're at. So the vast majority of MSMEs in a country like Kenya, for example, and I would argue within the East African region, are, because there are different stages in their kind of evolution and development, the concept of certification will mean different things at different times. So if you're just starting up, you're an emerging business, most of the young entrepreneurs are between the ages of 18 and 25. They've just finished high school. They may have partially had 1 or 2 years of college, largely self-driven, getting into entrepreneurship as an alternative to employment. You have at most 5 to 10 employees in your business. You do not have the cash flow or the capacity to engage with things like licensing, permitting, formalizing your structures, largely cash-based. Certification is a nonsense, right? You're just trying to go through your cash cycle of getting your inventory, funneling it through, getting some cash, rinse and repeat, and making your ends meet. Inevitably, micro enterprises grow up and they become small businesses. And I think the consistent definition of what counts as a small business is, having between 10 to 49 employees, having about, up to maybe 500,000 in annual revenues, 500,000 shillings in annual revenues. That begins to start having some meat on the bones, so to speak. And then at that stage, certification becomes a question of a trade-off in trying to organize your compliance, right? So you've probably had manual record keeping, digital platforms that enable you to keep some version of records, but you're trying to now bring it all together and make this business something that can stand on its own legs. At that stage, thinking about certification can help you just begin to understand what kind of process flows do you have? What kind of risks are there in those process flows? What kind of minimum requirements must your business meet in order to function, whether or not you're having a bad day, right? And so at that stage, it's really about minimum compliance with certain key requirements of the law. It's when businesses become medium-sized, right? When you're between 50 to 99 people, or between to 250 people. Again, it depends on whose numbers you're using. I try to define this number. And when you get to having actual assets in hand, and generating in excess of 1 million, like 5 million or more in turnover, that's when certification actually becomes a very important question. And I would say you need to start with certain forms of standardization like ISO, right? So you're not really going into specific ESG-driven certifications, but you are going into process and standards-driven certifications and trying to start from the ground up. And I'd be very interested to hear from John what that looks like for a small business that is lean on budget, but needs processes that it can standardize. And why does that matter? 2 reasons, primarily. One is because your risk perimeter is undefined. As long as your risk perimeter is undefined and your processes are not coherent, then you get to a point where you can't scale your business, right? And when you then start applying for financing, trying to get some kind of shift from having owner-driven and friends and family-driven capital into trying to get bank debt, inevitably businesses struggle because they don't have the right systems, they don't have the right records, they can't demonstrate tax compliance over a period of time. The so-called tick boxes are now taking a huge amount of headspace to make sense of. And so those ISO-related type of certifications really help. And then past a certain stage, when you want to get strategic investors, when you want to get people into your business who will help you think about how to grow it, improve your governance, attract the right kind of talent, then certification again is both a signaling device as well as a magnet. So it's a signaling device that says, look, we know we need to get there, and we're trying to enhance our systems, our processes, so that you as investors can track your impact and can track your return on investment from a social goods perspective. But also, we want to be able to play at a more consistently advanced level and get the benefit of the reputational positivity of being known as a business that has a certification that is internationally recognized. It kind of raises you above your domestic market profile into a more strategic profile. So I'd say, in short, it depends on where you are in your journey. I would also say, once you get to a certain stage, trying to figure out the right kind of, one of the interesting statistics I found as I was preparing for this was that even for medium-sized businesses, so 50 to 250 people, they inevitably end up with hybrid record keeping, because they'll be aware that it just makes sense to keep, physical records. And then they'll also be aware that increasingly your customers are coming to you online or through other platforms. So you have these parallel sort of digital records. And when you're trying to figure out what is the right platform to aggregate all of my record keeping into one thing, it's a real struggle, because there's like 100 different options and you don't know how to pick one, and you don't know which one will work for you. So ISO or other related certifications become helpful for streamlining your options and recognizing, I'll start here and then I can grow as my business scales into something else, and there'll be someone holding my hand. So I'll stop there for a second, but I think that's how I would think about the certification journey.
Thanks a lot, Ongo. I think that's become clear from what you said. I'm going to give myself away in what I'm currently reading, but it's essentially from James Clear, which is that we don't, we fall to the level of our systems. So essentially, from what you're saying, it's that, it's in the beginning, it's such a nuisance, you don't really think about it, but at the point of which you are really starting to try to scale and grow your business, this is quite a bit of a guiding light, a sort of a signal in terms of letting you know where you have fault lines and risks that are waiting for your business, and in terms of where the credibility issues might lie when you're trying to connect with investors. I think that's a very critical takeaway for our audiences here, which is the fact that, as much as you have your business, but when you're now really putting yourself out there, you need to put yourself out there as a well-packaged product, and certification can be the way forward for that. So I'd like to rope in Fikayo into this conversation. Where large corporates are concerned, and I like that you brought up the issue of the public-facing companies like MTN in Nigeria adopting the IFRS standards. How do these organizations, in West Africa navigate this balance of certification and regulation? What are the due diligence burdens that exist?
Okay, thank you very much, Rutendo, and thank you, Fangui, for the insights offered. I want us to think of it this way: certification voluntary, regulation mandatory. So the mandatory regulations, of course, are regulatory, legal and regulatory requirements that have been set by national and state, at the national and state level. And I'm just going to rope in John's contribution when he was talking about the ISO certification and data protection as if data protection certifications. So I'll just say that in terms of mandatory regulations, there's something my partner says, the rise of the regulators. In Nigeria, we have a lot of regulators going after big corporations. They're going after the Fortune 500, for lack of a better word. So what we typically advise clients as legal practitioners is to develop a regulatory compliance checklist or a compendium, and sort of have a priority checklist, a priority, itemize each checklist, each item based on priority level. So 1, 2, 3, depending on how important you classify it for your business. Because at the end of the day, the regulators will come after you if you are not compliant with the laws or with the regulatory requirements. As it relates to certifications, I would say, leaning on Wangui's contribution, it's more of a brand reputation, is more of an add-on for businesses. So most often than not, a lot of large corporates in Nigeria would go after some certifications such as the ISO certifications because they want to get that brand recognition. But priority is placed on the mandatory regulatory requirements. That's the regulation. So I would yield it back to Rutendo.
Okay, I think that's really helpful. Thanks so much, Fikayo. I think what's a bit surprising for me is the regulators going after the sort of bigger companies, but I suppose someone has a head has to roll to ensure that everybody is sort of complying, and you know it does have signal effects for the brand itself's reputation, but I think as well as the way that investors and people from outside those countries tend to see the ease of doing business and the trustworthiness of doing business in the country. Caroline, from your perspective, having been a company itself, being part of a company itself and having led an entire certification process, how does one assess, whether certification would deliver ROI? What does it mean for fundraising? I think Bongo and Fikayo have rightly sort of raised this as part of their intervention. And I'd like to know from an experience point of view, what that journey was like for African originals.
Thank you, Rotendo, and the other speakers. So how you assess whether a certification will deliver, first you need to know your why. Why do you want to certify as a business? What's the end goal? And then, so how we approached it, we also looked at what are the direct financial businesses, benefits that we're going to get. So this is because, as I said, we are a small business and we are pretty new and we are yet to break even. So at some point, everything that we do needs to at least pay off. So for the direct financial businesses, so we were also looking for a certification that is going to help us access new markets or even access clients who are willing to pay premium prices. So for instance, with the B Corp certification, it's quite big in the Europes. And as I said, we are now exporting into Europe. So that was something to help us penetrate that market. And then there is the cost savings from improved operational efficiency and waste reduction. Because one thing about certifications, they will require you to get your operations together. And that saves a lot in terms of raw materials, in terms of labor. It just helps align everything and it's a cost saver. And also there's the potential tax incentives and subsidies linked to the certification. And here the ISA also maybe after certification, also exploring what grants can you get to help support the business or specific projects within the business. And then outside the direct financial benefits, there are indirect benefits. Like for instance, there is a boosted brand reputation. So when a consumer sees our bottle has that B Corp certified B Corp, that means something to people, and it also helps create that brand loyalty. Then there's also employee attraction, because for instance with B Corp, one of the pillars is employees, how you treat your employees, and this helping the business to giving the business a framework to treat employees, there's the suppliers, there's the different stakeholders that helps with the retention of employees, of suppliers, of consumers. And then also there is looking at certification costs, because certifications are not cheap. I will not lie to you, they are not cheap, but also this conversation is about ROI. So there's always going to be that initial investment, but then there is a value. Then also there, let me see. Okay, so to the second part of the question, so how does the certification help fundraising? So for instance, in our case, when we first got that certification, when the announcement was made, we were going through a round of fundraising, and that was the fastest fundraising ever that we've done. So the certifications also bring a sense of credibility, where people see the B Corp logo or on your products, or even that you're ISO certified, and it gives them that assurance that you're a business that is here to stay. And then also there is transparency, because as I said, the other speakers have spoken to the disclosures that are required, and by being a good business, a business that is open, you're sort of like holding the mirror to yourself, but also inviting others to look in. So that transparency also, it projects that you are actively managing your risk, and that helps with fundraising. And also there is alignment, because you have like investors who fund different, like for instance, they are like green investors. So it helps you like align with investors who fund whatever like your business is aligned to. I think lastly, I actually think I've covered all my points, but I'm happy to take any questions, I think, as we go, if anyone has questions on ROI and how it affects fundraising.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Actually, you asked for a question, you get a question. I think, some key things that you've said that I just want to immediately bring to everybody's attention is that where certification is concerned, picking has to do with your priorities. What are you actually trying to achieve at the end of the day? And, it could be to access new markets. It could be to access a certain type of clientele. And, there's also the fact of it helps you reduce waste to some extent, right? Because now you have to go through this big overhaul of the entire business and see where the cracks are to align yourself with those standards. So those are some key things to consider. But on to the fact of getting a question, we have a lovely question here that many African businesses, especially SMEs, are concerned about the cost of certification and compliance, particularly when requirements are mandatory for market access or regulatory reasons. From your experience, and I guess this is to Caroline and all the speakers, how can businesses budget for and manage these costs without compromising competitiveness? Are there financing and phased implementation models that have worked in the African context, given the capital constraints that businesses face, and that most businesses are hinged on low margin thresholds? So I don't know if anyone who is open to starting us off. Caroline, you're very excited to answer the questions. And it's a bit of a mouthful, so opening it up.
Yeah, so I think I can start and pull from our context. So yes, we wanted to get certified, and we knew that it wasn't going to come cheap. So we planned it. In fact, I think we started the process. We started internal discussions, but so there was that planning period where, like, this is something that we want to achieve and we need to put money aside. But also with that said, I know there are funds that fund specific certifications. And for a business like ours, we manufacture alcohol, so it's quite tricky, like getting those grants. But depending on which industry that you're in, I believe that there are grants and funds that you can look into. I don't know if any of the other panelists have like more details on the specific grants.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. I think that's quite clear. Planning. So you don't just wake up in the morning and say, today is the day I'm going to become a big corp. There's quite a lot of planning that has to go ahead of time. I think, was it Wango who mentioned it? Like there is 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 years of sort of planning and embedding it within your business planning processes as you start to think about, the direction that your business is heading in. So again, planning is the root and the heart of everything. Anybody else want to take a stab at answering this wonderful question that we've got from our audience?
Yeah, if you allow me, Rutendo. So thank you. So yeah, so I think from where I stand and seeing how this process takes place for a lot of businesses, I think I'll begin by saying the way to go at this, and it's true, it's always, like I spoke before, there's always going to be that challenge in terms of fast resources, and then two, resource in terms of, manpower and time, and then obviously the key one, resources in terms of the payments that companies have to make. But I look at it differently, because a lot of the times when businesses are trying to make decisions that have money attached to it, then what you have to do is you have to think, what's the ROI? If we're putting up outcome, then does it justify the amount of money that we have to spend? And maybe I'll give a few examples just to clarify this a bit more, so it makes sense for a lot of people. And I'll go back to a couple of our certified B Corps. So I can begin maybe by Biofoods, and there could be people here who know Biofoods, but that's a dairy company based in Kenya. And prior to them certifying, they had access, and they are premium dairy business. You know, they serve, you know, the middle class and upper middle class because of the pricing and the process that they put their products through. Now, prior to that, it wasn't so certain and so straightforward that they would have certain clients, even though they aspire to have those clients. But with them certifying, then that built up on what a lot of my fellow panelists have spoken before. They build up their value and their credibility. And now it's very common when you fly, you know, this international carriers and regional carriers, that your dessert is going to be, for the most part. In fact, now we make a joke in the team, because if you're flying in the southern region, your dessert is going to be a Danone product, which is also a certified B Corp in South Africa. If you fly within East Africa and the region, it's probably going to be a Biofoods. If you fly in Northern Africa region, it's going to be also another company that we have in the process that's just about to certify. But if you look locally here, and if you look at the other players in that industry, in the dairy industry, there's big names there, but how come their desserts are not in those strategic organizations? If you go to any five-star hotel now and you're having your breakfast or your dinners or your lunches, that is also going to feature. So how have they suddenly become so attractive to such brands? And if you look backwards, you then realize that businesses understand that companies who subject themselves to a more rigorous process to ascertain that what they claim to do is exactly what they claim to do, and especially if that certifying body is a credible certifying body, then that company then picks that benefit of credibility, and it goes and speaks beyond their brand. And therefore then what that does is then it brings a lot of value back to the company, the manufacturing business. I could go on and on, you know, a perfect example also that comes to us is Spring Valley Coffee. When they certified as a B Corp, they were trying to get a location in London to set up a store. And it was pretty competitive area. And so a few people were due to go and, you know, meet the realtors. And as soon as the Spring Valley Coffee founder showed up, and he had his business card and it had the B Corp IP logo on it, pretty much opened the door for him. And now he has a location. So it goes without saying that a business then has to sit and I think there's the aspect of planning that has been mentioned, but then there's also the aspect of forecasting and seeing how much work do you have to put into it in terms of man hours, in terms of financial resources, and what is the benefit that comes up back to us, and what is the timeline that we have set out for ourselves to achieve this, and is that realistic, and can it actually be achieved? I think it's also important to mention that it's true, certifications are not cheap, but it's also important to mention that the value also, because if you say, for example, and our certification fees are on our website, and it's pretty clear. If a company is paying a fee of $1,000 annually as a certification fee, but then they've built their brand 3 times over, right? They've made sales maybe 4 times over, because, and these are factual numbers. Every company that we certify has to recertify in 3 years. That period between that initial certification and the 3rd year certification, a lot of the times the businesses have grown in revenues 2-folds, right? So then the question is, and we never have pushbacks in terms of certification fees. So also I'm not certain if it's just something that people just bring onto discussions, because I don't know any company that has come into the certification process and has had any pushback in terms of the certification fees. So I'm never really sure, but the other question comes up all the time, so I can't really ignore it. But I'm never sure whether the companies have done all their research before they come up to us, so therefore then they don't have any pushbacks, or by the time they're coming to us, they've done the analysis and they see that this is going to be a very clear benefit to us, or it could just be a concern that goes on. with business leaders, which is perfectly fine. Yeah, but we are also a non-profit organization. So that might also be the distinction between us and a lot of the other certification. But yeah, I'm not going to say that that's not a concern. However, then that's sort of like the thinking that I see a lot of businesses bring into this conversation, and to determine how best to then move on with being compliant and certifying. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I think that's a useful question that we will continuously come back to, right? Which is exactly how do we think about the cost, or is it like the immediate shock of it when it looks at you, or the process of actually meeting the standards? Perhaps that becomes quite a scary process. Actually, as we are speaking about the issues of cost, I just want to rush my speakers over here into speaking of issues of costs and capacity, given that we're already on the subject. Perhaps, John, you can speak to us about the lessons from ISO and digital compliance for cost-effective certification. I think perhaps, we were looking at it from the kinds of certification Fabian's organization would do, for instance, versus the one on digital. There could be other considerations that people have to take into account that are not necessarily based on, for example, manufacturing or FMCG goods. I don't know if you could maybe take us through, sort of that process specifically.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Ntendo. And looking at cost, the starting point is what Wangui spoke about, minimum compliance. For instance, if you are required to implement 93 controls, you identify what applies to us. So identify what needs or must be met, then avoid unnecessary scope creep. You don't have to go for all 93 controls, and perhaps what applies to you is X. And the other approach is to look at it from a phased approach. You start with the requirements. You say, we're going to do this, we're going to go to this level, we're going to do a risk assessment, and this we are going to certify at this point. What we've seen for very small organizations is that they build internal capacities. You start by training them. And we've worked with organizations that are less than 10 employees, where they say, we don't have money, and we work with them in terms of, can we create a phased implementation for you, starting by training, capacity building for your team, so that they can also be part of the implementers. And the continuous years, the second and third year, they can be able to help in terms of audit, because some of this certification requires that every year you conduct an internal audit. And the third year you do recertification, as Fabian spoke about it. So part of what we do is to try and help build internal capacity, and you leverage on the resources that are available. We've worked with organizations that have done only one project, and they're required to certify for it to go global. And the resources are very minimal. So you sit down with them and identify, how do we meet at the middle in terms of costs? Yeah, so there are many different ways of going about it to scale, the cost down, to use the tools that are available. If you need to integrate 2 or 3, you can approach an integration of 2 standards at the same time. Yeah, while you also build internal capacity.
Thanks a lot, John. I think you said something that's at the heart of this conversation, right? One has to leverage the resources that are available to them. And I also like the idea of, meet your requirements legally first, right? Because it's the most, when it comes back to bite you, it'll come back to bite you. So meet those requirements first, train internally, and then, sort of start angling for the more external standards. Likely that, by the time you get there to the external aspect of things, you're sort of on the right direction. But speaking of that, right, and this is where I want to come back to Wangui, is that a few things have come to light, right? Caroline mentioned the fact that to some extent, where the regulations fail to have frameworks that are robust, certification kind of fills this gap. And I remember when we were doing our convening call, Wango, you also mentioned that there's sometimes some divergence with local laws and certification standards, and bringing them together becomes a challenge. So I'd like to ask you, how can local laws better support certifications without overburdening businesses?
No, thanks, Rutendo, and really appreciate the insights from from John, from Fabian, from Caroline as well, because they just speak to the fact that it's complicated. I think the major issue we have, speaking about Kenya, but I would venture to say East Africa, and I'd be curious to hear what happens in West Africa as well. The very significant issue we have is threefold. One is very broad policy statements and frameworks, which don't get reduced into regulation through structured consultation. And so what happens is there's a policy framework, and then one day, just out of, quote unquote, out of nowhere, there's a regulation. And the regulation comes with very short timeframes, very steep penalties, and a sense of the regulator coming at it from an enforcement perspective that says, we are catching you out. We are catching out businesses that have been doing the wrong thing. And so with effect from 1st September, all of you comply, or else, millions of shillings in fines, So the relationship between policy and then regulatory development is skewed in a way that makes enforcement punitive. And so then you have industry associations, stakeholders rush off to court and say, stop this is unconstitutional, or there was not enough participation, or this isn't hasn't been done properly. And there's a vicious cycle of misalignment. So, the government and other stakeholders are embarrassed that this did not get off the ground, and therefore adversarial towards the people who stopped it from getting off the ground. The people who are affected by it are cynical about the motivations of the policy. And so, rewind and repeat, right? There's a sense in which there is a bit of fatigue that creeps into the process. So how can certification and regulation work better together? I think sort of, and this will sound a bit idealistic, but recognizing where we need to be on the same side, right? We are on the side. Sustainable business is good business all around. It's good business from a taxation perspective. It's good business from a quality of life perspective. It's good business from an economic growth perspective. And so reframing in a sort of long-term way just helps the conversation. That's one. But two, I think it's really on private sector actors to, in a way, do more, to have more persistent engagement with the people who are designing policies and designing regulations and so on. So the issue of short-term electoral cycles that mean people don't really, you come in with grand plans and then you have a very short window to achieve any of those plans. And at some point you lose motivation as legislative or policy stakeholders and you move on to your next election cycle, really affects the continuity of the discussion. And so it's for the industry actors through their associations, through their other points of advocacy, to be the consistent voice in the conversation that enables a longer term direction that is sustainable from a certification and regulation perspective. And then I think encouraging maybe the regulatory sandbox approach to ESG and to sustainability. There's a sandbox approach that's been tried very successfully on technology, on payment platforms, for example, in Kenya, or a capital markets type of initiatives. But perhaps we could have regulatory sandboxes around certain types of ESG or compliance frameworks for SMEs, for example, and start trying to track what is the actual ROI or what is the actual intended benefit from an alignment of stakeholders with regard to certain types of ways of regulating, so that we stop trying to use, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And a lot of what is presented as a regulatory framework or compliance framework for companies generally starts with multinational or very large corporations in mind. And so there's just a complete incoherence, right? You put a very heavy burden on a small business and you fail to recognize it needs time to grow, or your approach is so minute that you're not moving the needle. So I think Having a regulatory sandbox approach might be helpful, but it's a really, I think African businesses really do suffer because, at each point of your scaling, you start and you're overburdened. You're trying to scale, you're overburdened. You get to a larger scale, you're burdened still. So something needs to give in that context.
Thanks a lot, Wangwe. I think that's very clear, right? There is this vicious cycle that businesses getting caught up in. But I really like the fact that you brought up the agents in the productivity businesses can have, in the sense that they can have a longer shelf life than your typical sort of government administration. So they can keep continuing the conversation and keep shaping, sort of the terms and conditions of what that space can look like between regulation, policymaking, and enforcement. Speaking, I would be very open to actually hearing, from the Nigerian side, what we're seeing. Are we seeing similar things to what Wangwe is speaking about? Are we seeing this vicious cycle there too, or it's just concentrated in East Africa and we should all just pack up our bags right now and go?
Oh, thank you so much, Rutendo. I'll say from a Nigerian perspective, it's important to highlight that we operate a multi-layered and multi-stakeholder approach to environmental and climate regulations. And I'd say that creates a divergence of legal and regulatory compliance obligations for businesses and stakeholders. To set the context and to mention a few, we have a plethora of laws that businesses need to comply with. We have laws, regulations, guidance across industries. So I'm just going to run briefly. We have the Climate Change Act, and the Climate Change Act is a bit generic in its approach. It provides a framework for achieving low greenhouse gases emissions, and it applies to ministries, departments, agencies, public and private companies, and it creates an obligation on companies with more than 50 employees to put in place measures to achieve their carbon emission, and also they're required to submit annual reports on their efforts at meeting their carbon emission reduction. And there's also the NESRE, which is the National Environmental Standards and Regulations Enforcement Agency. So this particular agency is responsible for enforcing environmental standards, regulations, policies, guidelines. They also develop policies and guidelines and regulations. And these agencies so far have developed over 35 environmental regulations. So it's quite broad, and it's sort of difficult for companies to actually comply with all of these regulations. Then there's also the Nigeria Energy Transition Plan. It's a plan, not necessarily a policy, but it sets out a timeline and a framework for Nigeria to attain emission reduction across 5 key sectors. That's power, cooking, oil and gas, transport, industry, all by 2060. Then I've talked about the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. I'll say with respect to international certifications, some of these international certifications offer very stringent requirements, such as gap analysis. Companies are required to provide evidence of necessary documentations of their alignments with the standards. There are periodic assessments of performances, development of action plans, internal audits, management reviews, certification audits by external bodies, and some of these are not necessarily or widely provided for under our national and state laws. So it's sort of a bit difficult for companies to sort of tie the loose ends and marry the requirements under this international certifications and what our laws provide. So I had mentioned the Nigeria Energy Transition Plan. I'll say that the scope and focus of our national laws, our national and state laws, and this international certification sometimes can be different. So like I mentioned, the Nigeria Energy Transition Plan, using it as an example, it focuses on 5 key sectors. So if perhaps you want to align with the plan, if your sector doesn't fall within that sector, then it's a bit difficult to sort of align. Then I'd mentioned the Climate Change Act. I said it's a bit generic in its approach. A particular obligation that the Climate Change Act imposes on companies that have above 50 employees is to submit annual reports. There's actually no form, no shape, no guideline on how they're supposed to submit this annual report. And if I'm being truthful to you, I do not think that is actually put in practice. So there's so many obligations that companies have to meet up with when it comes to these national laws and the international certifications, and it creates confusion if we're being if we're putting things in perspective. Aside from that, I've talked about scope and focus of the divergence between the national laws and the international certification. Then there's also measuring and reporting conflict. So I talked about the Climate Change Act that mandates companies that have over 50 employees to submit annual reports. So there's no shape or structure. Then there are also international certifications. We have the ISO 14001, and that is more detailed. So these are some gaps, and I'd say some areas that sort of creates a dilemma for businesses. So thank you.
You scared me into muting myself. So no, I think it's clear from what Wangwe and Fikaya are saying, right? That in addition to just the gaps in national laws themselves, there's also the gap between the international standards that are global best practice and how they are being localized. And I think in our convening call, this is an issue that, sort of, Caroline, you've also somewhat touched on. And so, I want to pose this question to Fabian, Caroline, and John. When we're looking at these international standards, when we're looking at the fragmentation of local laws, what can be done, or what are you seeing being done in terms of localizing the standards to also, somewhat meet the realities of these fragmentations? Or perhaps maybe it's not even necessary. I'd really love to hear from you guys, like, in your experiences and in your work, what are you seeing? I mean, one way, and if kind of deathly scared me.
Yeah, no, thank you. Allow me to, I don't know what's up with my lighting, so I'm not even sure how, yeah, I can tell it's looking, so I'll be adjusting it, and as soon as it's clear, then I'll be back on my video. But to answer that question, first of all, I'd just like to go back and also make it very clear that, I mean, one of the things, if you look at, for example, the EU regulations, all this were, there was like elaborate discussions within the EU Commission, and then as soon as those were, finalized, then, those regional governments then have to go and then discuss them within their parliaments and then ratify those. Now, what is going to happen then is that a lot of our governments are then going to be playing second place, where now they have to institutionalize laws so our local businesses can then become compliant to the regulations that were discussed and arrived on from the EU and then ratified within the governments in the EU. From where I see it, I think it should have been more complementary than that, right? It should have been where, as they're also discussing, the regulations that I think really align very well with their governments in their region, then we're also doing the same. And then we come together somewhere at the top, and then we sit and we find a complementary way to then work, other than, them setting the tune, and then we then follow along, and we have timelines that we have to actually meet this. Secondly, I think that harmonization is also lacking, because there are so many, and to be honest, at the end of the day, we sort of like aim to achieve the same thing with businesses, right? We work to generally just bring businesses to the front that have a very clear aspiration to just do well and be a force for good, and set that standard for a lot of the players in their industry. Now, the question is, and I know we do it, because if a business is ISO certified, if a business is fair trade certified, when they come onto our certification scheme, they get credits from that. I just think, I don't know how it can be done, but I just think there can be way better harmonization just to make sure that it's also not so exhausting for businesses to have to go through this process to become compliant and, you know, drive the same vision that we are all working towards. So those two. Now, circling back, but allow me maybe to come back to this. I think it would be nice to also hear from John and Caroline, not to take up too much time, because I see we have not much time left, but I'm happy to come back and share after they've given their insights, if that's okay.
Yes, that's all right, John.
Yeah, so thank you. So one is an alignment of the regulation with the certification. And I'll give you an example. All this Data Protection Act that we have in all the countries we spoke about, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Nigeria, South Africa, they've all borrowed from GDPR. Now, if your organization is across these 4 or 5 countries, you'll be required to comply with 3 or 4 different regulatory requirements that are almost the same thing. Whereas the ISO 27701 for privacy then takes care of that and can cover, you know, all that requirements across those areas. So there's some work towards that, and I know in our country in Kenya, there's lobbying to make sure that it's adopted by Office of Data Protection as an alternative to Data Protection Act of 2019. So there's that alignment of the regulation as a baseline and certification as the how, because what the law gives you is a baseline, but then how do you implement it? You implement it using a certification like now ISO. So there's that in terms of making sure that we localize and we implement what is needed, and then we bridge the gaps that are there, even as we comply with the law, because it's more than just compliance. Is more of making sure that, you know, you're delivering value and you're securing your organization and you're meeting the objectives that you want to meet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I think that's quite an important point.
Hi, Rotendo, can I just jump in right there to just buttress on the data protection points that was made? Okay, thank you. So yes, like the previous speaker has said, Nigeria, Kenya, we all got the our Data Protection Act from the GDPR, and we gained from the GDPR. And I'll say that in Nigeria, speaking from our legal perspective, it's not really a requirement to have the ISO standards. As a matter of fact, the Data Protection Commission, the Nigeria Data Protection Commission, recently issued a general application and implementation directive. We call it the guide in Nigeria, which is more like a robust framework that organizations are now required to comply with. Data controllers rather and data processors are now required to comply with, to show that they are, you know, aligned with best practices in terms of their data protection practices and procedures. So just to buttress that, in terms of data protection, you know, Nigeria is forging ahead, and that particular guide is going to be effective 1st of September. So data controllers and data processors are bringing themselves up to speed to ensure compliance and, you know, global alignment with global best practices. Thank you.
Thanks, Vika. I really hope we'll see Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa borrowing also from the guide in Nigeria, and that'd be quite nice to see, wouldn't it? Caroline, your insights?
Yes, thank you, Rotendo. So what I think has worked, I think seeing some certifications adapt standards that are alive to local realities. I think that is something very important, because sometimes you'll see a certification, but the formulation was based maybe on Europe, but it needs to be adopted here, doesn't work. So it's really good to see like certifications that are being tailored to take into account the different context. And then also I've seen, so for instance, I talk a lot about B Corp because we are certified. certifications that also invest in capacity building and training, because there are so many certifications and it's really tough, like understanding what will we achieve out of this, or how do we even approach it. So seeing on-ground training and technical support that's affordable to small businesses, that is something that works, and I think more certifications need to invest in. Something else that I've seen, so for instance, with the Rainforest Alliance, is having like a tiered approach to certification, because these certifications are quite steep, like even the requirements, it takes time. And I think something to help businesses like not lose heart is that tiered approach. So for instance, with Rainforest, they'll have like a verified certification before you get the full certification. That is something that shows like with the staff within the business, like the internal stakeholders and the external stakeholders, that you are on a journey. Something else that actually maybe what I think hasn't worked is the opposite of that, like having a one standard fits all approach to certification. That does not work. And also even with things like the high cost of certification, something that I think maybe certifying bodies or organizations need to take into account is having a prorated payment system, because it reduces the impact of like having to make that big investment at a go, because like the process takes time. So if maybe you can have like X number of payments, I think it's something that is more accessible to companies from different places. Let me see. I think another challenge and something that does not work is limited access to markets post-certification, because if a company invests in a certification but they don't see the value, I feel like that sort of discourages them to pursue another certification. So I think that hand-holding by the certifying body to help businesses penetrate like different markets or achieve whatever goals is something that will encourage businesses to pursue more certifications. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I think that's really helpful. I think what we can really gather from this conversation is that on the businesses side, what needs to happen is quite a lot of planning and, sort of a reflection and a review of the current business model that you have, and to sort of embed within the, ESG compliance, whether in your country this is still voluntary or it's becoming mandatory. From, what Fikayo and Wango have said, just prepare yourself, just get it out of the way. It's the best thing that you can do for yourself. But I think an important thing that Caroline has also mentioned is the value of certification standards, is that it really pushes you to really rigorously and robustly look at your business practices, which can have significant benefits as you lead up towards certification. So for instance, things like supplier stickiness and employee retention. And some of the things that Fabian and John have mentioned, for instance, is we are seeing a need for greater local, greater harmonization of international standards with local realities, and that's something that continues to be a conversation and a pain point. And then I think finally a key takeaway that sort of everybody has really touched on in different aspects is the fact that there's a lot of fragmentation in the local laws, and they're making it increasingly difficult for the private sector. If we're going to be trusting the private sector to elevate sort of Africa's economies, then there has to be some kind of agency as well from businesses' side to keep the conversation going. They're experiencing the challenges, and so they know where the policies and their enforcement could be made better. So we are, time flies when one is having fun. I was having fun, definitely. So I want to encourage all of you to please use our QR code and our Q&A or our social media pages to please continue asking questions. If you're interested as well in more conversations about this, you've got the time and the space. BayLab is going to be hosting an annual summit in Joburg called Climate Modalities, ESG Impact Investment Inclusive Growth, from the 2nd to the 3rd of October 2025. So we'll just sort of put that in the chat for you. There'll be lots and lots of businesses. So for people who are interested in just sort of, again, making yourself investor ready for the international market. That could be an opportunity to speak to some couple of businesses over there. And also, I've always wanted to say this, from myself here at ALN Academy and everybody who's joined us, thank you so much for coming. Like, share, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. Have a lovely, lovely evening. Please continue the conversation, and we will be sharing this recording as well as some of the insights from our various speakers to assist you. And to my speakers, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your wonderful experience and insights that you've brought to bear. Have a good evening, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.